Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles on all of our shows, and we have special guests on every single one of them. This time, it's no exception. We have with us an author that I'm sure you've heard of, Jude Southerland Kessler. She is the author of a series of books on John Lennon. So far, she's put out 5 of them. Is it 5? Uh,
Five.
this is her third one, actually, and I'll tell you why we're talking about this specific one in just a moment. It's called She Loves You. It covers John Lennon's life from April of 1963 through March of 1964. And her goal is to cover John's entire life through, I think you told me, 9 books in total.
Right.
It
It will
should,
probably be 10 now because the most recent book, Shades of Life, which is 1965, I had to divide into 2 segments because it got so large that there was, everybody was going to sue me for carpal tunnel. We were up to 800 pages and we were just about to put the boys on the plane to come to America for Friday the 13th, the beginning of the 1965 North American tour. And, that includes Shay and Elvis. And there was so much yet to come, the making of Rubber Soul and the Homeland tour, the UK tour. So I said, okay, I got to stop. So that part 2 is coming out next year. And so unfortunately, I wanted it to be number 9 books.
yeah.
It's going to be.
Okay. Well, we have tremendous admiration for Jude because she tells John's story so thoroughly. Hey, come on, 10 books to cover John's life. That tells you everything right there. But we're going to talk to her about this particular book. But the reason why we are bringing up the 3rd volume, She Loves You, is because for the first time, she's putting out an audiobook of her John Lennon books. And our other guest is Scott R. McKINLEY, and he is a professional voice actor. And in the new audiobook, he does the voices for 183 people. Of course, the most important ones, you're going to get their voices so much more than the other ones. But we welcome Scott to talk about the new audiobook, and welcome to Ken Michaels Radio.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I appreciate it.
Now, why don't you both say how Scott became involved with She Loves You?
Okay. And I didn't get a chance to say, Ken, thank you for having us. Thank you very much. It's always daunting because you ask the tough questions and so, I mean, when I'm saying I prepared because you do, and we appreciate that. And I know your listeners appreciate that. So Thank you very much. I did not have an audiobook on my radar screen because I am working so hard to try to complete this John Lennon series. And let's face it, time is of the essence. I have this little snow globe that I keep on my desk and it says time is a gift. And I know, I've only have so many years to write 5 more books. So I try to stay very focused on doing that. But Scott sent me a free download of the book that he did for Jay Bergen, Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer. And I hadn't really listened to audiobooks. It just wasn't something that I did. I love to read. I love physical books. And so I listened to it, and 5 minutes, 10 minutes into it, I was like, oh my gosh, this guy isn't an impersonator. He's not someone trying to do John Lennon. You see lots of bad John Lennons. This guy is John Lennon. I mean, like, for example, how John, if he's going to say no, always says, nah, no. It's always, nah, no. That's not in my book, but Scott has that when he has John speaking both in my book and in Jay's book. He chews gum. He was John Lennon. So I got in touch with him and I said, look, is there any chance you could do Paul as well as you did John? Yeah, I think so. I said, what about George? He goes, George is my best. And so I'm starting to get excited. I'm like, can you do Ringo? And he goes, yeah. Well, not only that, I think one of his best, second to his John, is his Brian. Perfect. Tony Barrow, Sid Bernstein, Ed Sullivan, Trini Lopez, Bobby Goldsboro. These were hard voices to do because people know these voices. And he studied, and he learned each one of them. And The more we work together, I am a very John Lennon-esque, things are going to go wrong. I know it's going to go wrong. They're not going to want us in the States. So what is my plan B going to be? I'm going to tell people we just went over there to listen to the music. I always have a fallback. I always have a plan B. I never think anything is going to go right. The more I work with Scott, the more I thought, this is great. People are going to love this, not because of me, but because of the way he read it and the way he acted it. He had me in tears. And I've read this stuff, you know, and he had me falling off my chair laughing. It was one of the very few times in my life when I was actually optimistic about something. So that's how I got hooked. He is so good. And just a plug, because it's a sincere plug for Jay Bergen's book. You don't ever get new John Lennon stuff. It's the same stuff. It's over and over and over the same stuff. This was stuff that sat in Jay Bergen's garage in a box for years. It's court testimony from the trial against Morris Levy to try to stop his album Roots that he did, that John was going to ultimately polish and hone and turn into rock and roll. And John's court testimony tells about how he orders songs on an LP and why it's important that they go in a certain order, what the songs on Roots rock and roll mean to him, what they mean to him, how he does an album creatively. This is stuff we hadn't heard before, brand new material. And I bought the physical book, but I love the audio book. So Scott did a great job with it.
Yeah, just so you know, I interviewed Jay on this channel.
I know you did.
On the Things We Should podcast, we interviewed Jay. Tremendous guest, and highly recommend that book because, as you said, you feel like you're in the courtroom with John.
Yeah.
It's got exactly his testimony verbatim.
Yeah.
And just, you know, explaining what's important in releasing an album. You know, the album cover for Roots was a shoddy looking cover from 1968. These were tapes that John sent to Morris Levy that were not the master tapes, so the sound quality wasn't as good. You know, so many factors. And it's all covered there in that book. So I highly recommend the book. And if you haven't seen the interview that I did with Jay, check that out, and the one on the Things We Said Today podcast. But Scott, this whole process of doing all these voices, is this something that just comes easily to you? Are there any voices that you have to really struggle to
Neil Aspinall, for instance, did not come easily for me. I'd listened to him on a couple of interviews that he had done back in 1965, I think. He was captured during one of the Beatles live concerts, talking before the concert had started. And on the anthology, he's also interviewed. And try as I might, I got the British Liverpool accent okay, but every time I tried it, he just sounded like one of the Beatles when I said it out loud, and I thought that would be a little more confusing with the listener. So I tried to get close, but I couldn't get as close as I wanted to. So I didn't want to go over the top with that. But the Beatles were a little bit easier for me.
Were all the Beatles easy for you to do?
No. Ringo, I've never really practiced. I never really thought I could differentiate his voice from John's enough. I've been doing impressions or trying to do Liverpool speak since I was a kid, as I think most people of my generation did when you saw either A Hard Day's Night or Yellow Submarine for the first time. Especially as kids, you like the sound of the accent. It's just exciting that it sounds different, but it's still in English, so you understand it, and it just sounds musical just by itself. And I just loved trying to do the voices. So,
yeah, I have to ask you.
Yeah,
it's Jude brought up the name, and I'm reading a list of all these people that you do here. One of them is Bobby Goldsboro. Now, forgive me for not knowing this. What is Bobby Goldsboro's connection with the Beatles? I only know of one.
Well, evidently, he met them during one of their concerts, actually.
Okay.
Although Jude probably remembers the circumstances better than I do.
It
'cause
was on the
just
Roy
that one
Orbison
scene.
tour with the Beatles.
Okay.
And Bobby's family actually lived 4 doors down from me when I lived in Dothan, Alabama. We went to the same church, got to be good friends. So I got to meet and talk with Bobby. And he said, my big contribution on that Roy Orbison tour was I noticed that John was blind as a bat on stage. I mean, he would stomp or clap or swivel, but he wouldn't walk away from where he was very often because he couldn't see. And I said to him, look, I notice you're blind, and so am I. Have you ever thought about contact lenses? And John's like, they're going to hurt. They're glass. You think I'm putting a piece of glass in my eye? I'm not. And Bobby's like, I promise you, they will not hurt. They may be a little bit irritating, but it's going to open the world for you. And actually talked him into going to get contact lenses. And so that's the scene that's in the book, is them on the bus talking about their families, their wives, their career, and contacts on stage. So I lived in Dothan, Alabama 3 different times. My husband and I have moved 32 times in the 40 some odd years we've been married.
Wow.
And we've lived there 3 times. And it is, if you think the Louisiana accent is a Southern accent, you have to experience Dothan, Alabama. And Scott nailed it. He had that Southern drawl just right.
Were the Beatles familiar with Bobby and his music at all, or what?
Well, at that time, he's playing in a backup band. This is before he has his really big hits.
Yeah.
But he leaves the tour to go record his solo songs. He leaves the Roy Orbison tour to go do what's going to become the Bobby Goldsboro. Or as they say in Dothan's own Bobby Goldsboro. He leaves to become Dothan's own. But at this point, he is not famous. He's a great musician, and he's respected enough to be chosen to go on the Roy Orbison tour. I mean, that's pretty big. Sure. But he is yet to step into his own. It's like, when the Righteous Brothers got fed up at Forest Hills and said, that's it, we're out of here. What do? They go back and release their hits. So.
Wow. Can you spring a Bobby Goldsboro voice on us, Scott?
I can try. He's only in the one scene, but oh, hey, John, I've been noticing you don't wear your glasses much, except on the bus, that is. But you seem to need them. I mean, I'm pretty sure you're bat blind, aren't you?
All right, very good.
How's that, Jude? Close?
Yes, excellent. That is great. So good.
I'm glad that you included Bobby because, I know his hits. So I've been a big fan of his and never got to see him live. Don't know if he ever will tour again, but certainly hope he will. Anyway, the 4 Beatles, you want to give us a little bit of each of them?
Sure. Actually, I had a little piece from the book, if I can cue it up real quick here, of them just talking before a concert, and John's been reading the newspaper, and he's talking to the rest of the Beatles, and he goes, "Hey, Paul, did you know that Americans can't travel to Cuba anymore? It's off limits, Has been for over a month." "Yeah, right." Paul nodded as if this were old news. "It's dangerous over there. Yeah, Cuba, communist or something like that. And Fidel Castro's in Russia, as it were. He's there right now." "Oh, really?" Paul's eyebrows arched. "Well, see? Oh, there you have it then." "Who's where?" George sloughed into the room. He'd slipped into his stage shirt, but the cuffs hung loose and open. "John's keeping abreast of politics again. He's all about current events, is all John." "Yeah, he's a reader." "I had currents this morning," Ringo ambled in, "but I didn't read anything into it." "Get boxed all 2.5 here," John spat. "Hey, where's Orbison?" "I don't know. I saw him earlier, though," said Paul. "And get this, he asked if he could record one of our songs, that is, when he gets back to America." John let the echo fall into his lap. "If someone could measure success," he said, "that would be it, wouldn't it? Roy Orbison asking to record one of our songs.
That
I
was
could do the whole
fantastic.
Fantastic.
Now, when you have this kind of dialogue there, is this something that you know they said to each other, or is some of that?
No, whenever they're saying off the cuff comments like that, that's just, John, we know John reads the paper. In fact, he reads 3 newspapers typically every day. We knew he read the newspaper backstage. A lot of times people were talking and laughing and enjoying themselves. What is he doing? He's reading the newspaper. He keeps up with current events. Art Schreiber said that on the 1964 North American tour that John surrounded him constantly because Art was a reporter for the Westinghouse Network. He wanting to know about politics, wanting to know about Vietnam and what was going on over there. Why was Kennedy assassinated? Was there something behind it, or was it just a loony, as he would say? He was constantly learning and talking about and obsessed with current events. That was his thing. The others teased him about it a lot. Get your nose out of a book. In Hard Day's Night, the thing about parading and books, although it's directed at Ringo in the film, was really directed at John in real life. You need to come into the real world, close that book, experience life. So it's based on things that really happened. But the words, I have no idea what they said backstage while waiting for Roy Orbison. I do know, however, the opening exchange in that chapter, which is one of my very favorites, where Roy Orbison arrives at the theater on the very first night and sees nothing but signs of girls saying, "We love the Beatles, we love you Beatles," and he says to someone, and this is recorded, "What's a Beatle?" And John, who's standing behind him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "I am." And he said, "Well, who are you?" "I'm John Lennon. It's a band." And Roy Orbison said to him, "Well, John, girls love you." And I just thought that was just such a great little snippet to include, So sometimes I will get really, really lucky with the, bazillions of different books and angles that people have captured. Thank you, everybody. Like the day that Uncle George dies, or right after he died, when John returns from Scotland, and he hasn't been told that his uncle has died. And he doesn't know that they've had the funeral. He doesn't even know he's gone. And when he comes in the house and throws his bag down and screams, "I'm home," we know that Mimi there was no answer. He goes into the kitchen. I know from, I believe it's George Tremlett's book, that Mimi had her back to him, is peeling carrots at the kitchen when she says, "Your Uncle George has died. There's nothing for it. Don't cry."
Yeah, it rings very well in that chapter, I'll tell you.
It just, a lot of things we know from people who saved little bitty snippets. But up to about 1961, in the first volume, should have been there. I don't know exactly what Mimi said when they phoned her from the high school and said, "John's been suspended for the last 2 weeks and he can come back tomorrow." And she had no idea he'd been suspended because he'd been at Julia's house for the last 2 weeks. I can guess what she might have said, but, so some of that, no.
I was going to ask, why didn't you go back to the first volume of your book for an audiobook and just work your way up?
Well, Scott, go ahead.
We thought of that. And to be honest, I was a little concerned about doing voices younger, that much younger. And although I never talked to Jude about that, but she thought right now it's the 60th anniversary of the events in She Loves You. It's a good time to have an audiobook out. Plus, it's the 60th anniversaries of when the Beatles popped. And it's all the excitement that you're really going to get from a good audiobook. You're going to have it in this particular volume. So to make up for the fact that it's volume 3, Jude specially wrote 2 prelude chapters, introductory chapters, summarizing the first 2 books. And so it actually reads as a standalone audiobook without having to listen to the first 1 or 2 or read the first 2 books.
And that was Scott's idea. I didn't think about doing that. And that was a long process, because to take a 900-page book and condense it to, he said, don't make the prelude too long. Each one of the preludes are an hour, but that's a 900-page book condensed into an hour. And you don't want to lose the heart and soul, because book number one is it will always be my favorite book, because it tells you, William Wordsworth said, the child is father of the man. If you don't understand John's childhood and the teen years, you'll never understand John Lennon, because those childhood and teen years formed who he will be forever. So one of the things you got to consider prior to the beginning of She Loves You, prior to probably May of 1963, the Beatles have one product out. They have Please Please Me. They are not, they are popular in the UK. They are really, as Maureen Cleave said, they go a bomb. They are huge in the UK, but they're not known in America. And in this book of She Loves You, Beatlemania breaks out. The term is coined. They do the Roy Orbison tour. And one of the things that we talk about in this book is the writing of She Loves You. We've always been told that on that magical night at Newcastle on Tyne, they sat down together and they wrote She Loves You, and they honed it the next day at Paul's father's house in Forthland Road. But Paul says in the anthology, while we were on the Roy Orbison tour, inspired by Roy and a little bit challenged by him. They want to get to the toppermost of the poppermost, and that means knocking off even Roy Orbison. We began working on the bus on a new song, a song that we thought was going to be our best one yet, and it was From Me to You. Well, it's not From Me to You. That's been recorded on the 5th of March and is already in the can. It's been done. This is June now. And the song that they are writing is not Pretty Woman, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. So they've been working on it on the bus, listening to Roy, getting ideas. And then they go to Newcastle on Tyne and finish it up. And then they go to Paul's house and finish it up. So that's a big turning point. And it's in here. They play Sunday night at the London Palladium, which is so big. People don't realize that's Ed Sullivan for England. Yeah. And Ringo's family has always said, play the Palladium and die. Once you've done the Palladium, you're done. So he throws up in a bucket backstage before they go on to the stage. He's really nervous. 2 weeks later, that they're at the Royal Command performance. This is huge. It's their first Christmas record. They go to Paris and entertain young men because the girls can't get out because they'd have to be chaperoned, and it's at night. And it's an audience really full of, this is the first time they've ever performed for audiences predominantly male. They get that news that they've gone to #1 in America with I Want to Hold Your Hand. It is a joyous moment. And of course, the myth that they weren't going unless they got a #1 is so not true, because Brian booked the trip to America back in the fall. They were going, ready or not, they were going to America. But yay, they get this #1. They go and they think they're not going to be loved. They think they're not going to be accepted. It was the right book. The excitement, Ken, the excitement.
Let me just say one thing about what you just mentioned about Paul's comment about not coming to America until I remember the first time I heard Paul say that, and it was in the McCartney interview album from 1980 or 81. Oh. And it's always said in the context of the Ed Sullivan Show. But I really do feel, and I just met with Bruce Spicer recently, he thinks what Paul really meant to say was that they wouldn't tour the United States unless they had a #1. Not the Ed Sullivan Show, not the Carnegie Hall and Washington Coliseum shows, right? But the tour of the summer.
Probably true. I never thought about it that way. That's probably true.
Paul, I don't think explains it properly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, we're going to talk in detail about 1963 in just a moment. I do want to touch upon a few things with Scott because I noticed that one of the voices that you do is Cynthia Lennon. So
Yeah.
do you do many female voices in this book?
I do not that many, to be honest. Maureen is in there for a little bit. Trying to think. Oh, and Mimi is in there too. Yes. But not too many other women besides a few women reporters and Bob Freeman's wife, I think.
Okay.
But I don't remember if I had to do any others.
Is it difficult for you to do a female voice? Is it more?
It was hard to do Cynthia because Jude was, yeah, that was important to Jude. And
Yes.
she, yeah, made that very clear right from the very beginning that I had to get that right. So I studied it a little bit and I redid a chapter about 3 times before I sent her what I had done. And then I kept working on it after that. She
Read it
speaks with
her
a slight
book.
little lisp.
You know, I mean, she loves you. It's Cynthia's book. It's dedicated to Cynthia. And it is very focused on her relationship with John and her willingness to let him go and to go do his thing and to be supportive, but to make sure that John succeeded. And so she's front and center. And I was really worried. And I'm like, if you can do John Lennon and have that deep John Lennon voice, how can you do Cynthia? And I said, I want to hear Cynthia. He knocked it out of the park. Tell about what you observed about her little quirk of speech.
Well, she does have a little lisp of sorts. I was lucky enough to find online a little YouTube video that somebody had posted. I don't know where they got it from. An audio clip of her talking to Julian in like his crib or something in 1963. I'm sorry, geez, listen to me. In 1964, and just saying, "Oh yes," so just it helped quite a lot because most of the time when I was listening to Cynthia's voice, there were recordings from the 1980s or something when she's much older, and her voice has changed a little bit too. So it was a little more difficult. I could try to give a little bit of an idea of it if you have a specific passage in mind, Jude.
How about the Valentine's Day? Isn't there an exchange? I don't know, between or when
I
they're
think
in
so.
Paris, when they're in Paris on their honeymoon. That should be September of 1963,
Oh, give me
which
just a
is an
second to do
interesting
that up.
event in itself.
Hmm.
And a lot of this, Cynthia in Twist of Lennon records the events of the honeymoon. And then in her 2005 book, John, she goes into great detail about what they did. She has conversations with them. I'm so fortunate to be able to have all of this recorded. My daughter-in-law is listening to the audiobook and she said to me, you write these conversations exactly like what they would have said. I said, well, thank you, honey. I appreciate the compliment, but it is what, don't give me credit for it. This is what they said. Oh, well, I thought it sounded authentic. Well, yeah, it helps.
How do you define your books? Because they are biographies, but they're not strictly word for word what they said.
No, it is called a narrative history. And it's rarely ever done. People write historical fiction where they make things up. Narrative histories are rarely ever done because of the research involved in it. I mean, as Scott pointed out, almost 200 pages of the book is documentation, because I found out after the first book that people say, well, how does she know that? Well, where did that come from? And so I started footnoting, and when I did Shivering Inside Volume 2, I did about 375, I think, footnotes. Then they still were like, well, where'd that come from? Well, where'd that come from? So I started documenting almost every sentence. And it's gotten to the point now where it's so slow because I'll write a sentence, then I'll go to the footnotes, and it's like Davies, the Beatles lyrics, page so-and-so, Lewison, the Beatles recording sessions, page so-and-so. It takes as long to document as it did to write. It's just a slow process. Did you find something, Scott?
Yes, I did. And I was going to say it's like biography with story-based scenes.
Yeah.
but all of it is anchored in footnotes and sources and interviews. So
Okay.
none of it is whole cloth as far as that goes.
Yeah.
And the language is actually very good as far as the dialogue goes. I had to read some dialogue that somebody else had written for a demo I was recording, and he'd written it as if John Lennon had said it, and I did terrible with it because it didn't sound authentic.
Hmm.
And I'm like, he wouldn't say that. And I had to have him rewrite it about 3 times. But anyway, I did find a little bit about in Paris, where John and Cynthia are getting ready to visit, and Cynthia's not had a good time on the plane. And so he said, "You love Paris, and he squeezed his wife's hand. So you've always said, ever since your 21st. Cynthia had rinsed her mouth in the tiny airplane bathroom and had been given Coca-Cola. This is after she'd gotten sick. I mean, there's the Arc de Triomphe, the one Napoleon constructed, in honor of the soldiers, the ones who kept France's aware. I didn't think you were keen on that sort of thing. But it's all really larger than life, isn't it?" John slurped down a scotch and coke. "I mean, the thing's so outsized that this man once flew a biplane right through it. And troops returning from the battlefield marched underneath it, just for effect." "Mocking show?" Cynthia smiled a little. "Yeah. We'll go there one night with all the lights lit and the car spinning around it like mad. With that long street, radiating out from it as far as the eye can see. Powerful, really. I mean, that's what it's all about, sin power. And we'll drink strong coffee and eat croissants at midnight. If you're up to it."
Very good. Very good. I'm the John Lennon voice is very convincing to me. I mean, you really mastered that, I think. Definitely. You said that George was the one you did.
Oh yeah. I just when I was younger my voice was much higher, obviously. But and I loved his Scouse accent is so much thicker than the others. It just becomes more or less a challenge to try to get it right and be convincing with it, you know. And I loved his lines from A Hard Day's Night. "You don't see many of these nowadays, do you?" "Oh, by all means, I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality." Just, I love the sound of it.
Oh yeah. He's fussy with his drums.
They loom large in his legend. When I was a kid, I tape recorded that off the television before there were VHS tapes, and I listened to it, I don't know how many times, but I'd had most of the first 20 minutes just about memorized at one point. This is long before I did voice acting or anything. I think it was in college.
Yeah, I know a lot of fans that have that movie memorized and help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every now and then in conversation, we'll just say a line and we'll know what we're referring to. That other
Yep.
people around us won't have any clue what we're talking about.
That's our family. It's constant. It's constant Beatle quips.
But I'm also figuring if you were to do an audiobook on the first volume or second volume, you'd probably have a lot of people from John's childhood for whom you have no idea what they sounded like when they spoke, and being extremely young at the same time. You had to go at a certain period where there'd be enough main people where you can really, hone in on their voices. And so it probably makes the most sense that you started with this one.
Yep. I would do a lot more accent training to get the Liverpool accent much better. Right now, instead of doing that as much, I just focused on just getting the voices of the specific Beatles right.
Right.
And so I was fortunate. I'm a member of an audio drama group from the UK. They have monthly meetings and Americans drop in on those. And I did my accent and they said, "Well, that doesn't sound like Liverpool. It sounds like John Lennon." I thought, "Oh, accomplished." That's all I needed to know was did I get that part right? And so I'll when I go and do the first two, I certainly hope we have a chance to. I will get a lot more in depth into the regional accents in England. I'm
Yeah.
actually researching that now.
When the Beatles first broke big, when people wanted to imitate them, they would do a very exaggerated Liverpool accent. Too
Yes.
that it would be kind of, I don't know, embarrassing.
Well, look at with the Beatles cartoons.
Yeah.
Paul Frees, for goodness sakes. I don't remember who did Ringo's voice in that, but not exactly close.
Stop
Or
jeez.
who did the voices in Jungle Book? Remember, the vultures in Jungle Book were supposed to be the Beatles.
Right.
Yeah.
But Brian Epstein said, no, he vetoed that and just couldn't believe that they assumed that they would just had time to go ahead and do that. So they got pretty good sound alikes, I thought. So much so that I remember the first time watching it, I'm like, was that supposed to be the Beatles as a kid?
Yeah.
And my parents were like, oh.
We'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
So let's get into a conversation here about 1963.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, even though I've been a fan and done work in radio for 40 plus years, the more you study them, since so much information has come to light, they're even more fascinating than ever before. And the one thing that you pick up about 1963 is that they barely had a day off.
Right.
They barely had time to breathe. Between their concerts at the time, BBC appearances, recording sessions, interviews. It was just, I don't know how they adjusted to something so different. I mean, they were busy before that, but not to this extent. Once Please Please Me became a #1 single on all but one of the British charts. The Please Please Me album was #1 for 30 weeks in England, only to be knocked out by With the Beatles. The whole year it was dominated by the Beatles and their singles. And so I think what I would like to pick apart in your brain there, Jude, and Scott, you can chime in, is how did John react to all this? I mean, for all this time, this big build up, where are we going, fellas? To the top, Johnny, to the toppermost of the poppermost. Well, it's not world domination yet. That would be a year from this moment here for 1963. But you couldn't get any bigger than they were in the UK at that point. Was this something that John in particular took with ease because he had 3 friends to share it with? Or did he feel, based on all the research that you've done, any kind of enormous pressure to keep up with this and to keep cranking out good material and having hits and everything? How do you think John responded to this, exactly what he was hoping for, this kind of success? Was it easy for him to accept, or was it more complicated than that?
Yeah, in 1963, he was loving life. I mean, just as you said, everything he had ever dreamed of was coming true, and coming true very rapidly. Now, they're not an overnight success, because if you go back and think, their roots are in the late 1950s. And they're in 1960, they're playing in a strip club in Liverpool for Janice the stripper, and then they're going back to Bergen, staying in the Bambikino, where they're bathing in the sink of the movie theater with cold water. I mean, they paid their dues. So it's not an overnight success. But suddenly in 1963, everything is rolling and it's moving. And in 63, by everything that I've read, he is enjoying it. He's amazed by it. He's overwhelmed by it, but loving it. The very first time that I get a hint that he's beginning to be frustrated is after they returned to England and begin on the 2nd of March, they start making A Hard Day's Night. Simultaneously, he is finishing In His Own Right, because the publishers are breathing down his neck for him to get that done. Then when he wins the Foyles Literary Award and is told that he has to give the postprandial speech, and he's going to be standing in front of literary geniuses. I mean, he's seated next to Lionel Bart. The room is full of authors, and he has to stand up and give a speech. He calls Brian the next day and says, I can't do it. I mean, I can do lots of things. I can stand on a stage with three people I love and sing in front of thousands, but you can't make me give a public speech. That's a different thing entirely. And Brian says, I'll give it for you. But you know what happened. John doesn't have his contacts on. He's been out drinking the night before. His eyes are dry. He can't put them in. He doesn't know Brian's in the room. And when he doesn't introduce Brian, Brian thinks he's decided to do it himself. And it's you've got a lucky face and sit down. And thankfully, Brian does come up and give the speech for him. But John's overwhelmed by some of the things they're asking him to do. In August, they buy Kenwood, and they're going to take it from a 24-room house to a 16-room house. But they're not going to live somewhere else the way that people would do now if you have that much money. They're going to live upstairs in the attic while this is going on. The sawing and the hammering and the noise. Now, for 2 months of it, John's gone to America on the 1964 North American tour. But when he comes home and he's trying to make Beatles for sale, there's all of this noise. They don't get in the house until the next spring. So if you've ever remodeled a house, just that alone is enough to put you over the top. If you've ever written a book, just that alone is enough to, you're nervous, you're trying to get it done. The tremendous pressures of making a movie, performing live, touring America, and Canada, North America, for almost 2 months, having to perform sometimes 2 gigs a day, coming home and making Beatles for sale, going on the UK tour, doing their next Christmas record, and doing the Beatles Christmas show. They were asked to do too much. It was too much. And by the end of 64, he's exhausted. And now what are we going to do in 1965? Hey, it's the same year all over again. This time the movie's going to be called Help. And this time the book is going to be called Spaniard in the Works. And they won't have a Liverpool premiere this time, but there's the London premiere. We're going to go on the North American tour. We're going to do the Homeland tour. They almost don't go on the Homeland tour, but they end up going. And we're going to make Rubber Soul. 65, the reason I call that book Shades of Life is because it's the same year, only this time, as B.B. King says, the thrill is gone. You know, they're starting to get weary and they're starting to get afraid because Beatlemania has escalated to such gigantic proportions. You look at photos of the Houston 1965 concert, that is violence to the nth degree. There are people flinging themselves on the stage. They're throwing their folding chairs. It's a very dangerous concert. And when they land in Houston, you know this, Ken, the fans break through the cordon. They run straight toward that plane with those propellers turning. Luckily, the pilot's able to go off to the side a little bit and shut the plane off. And he stops the rotors before the fans get there. But they proceed to climb up on the wings, smoking cigarettes with that hot jet engine right there. And the Beatles are saying, we're going to be killed. We're going to be killed. And they get that high lift out to the plane to take them off. When Brian steps onto the lift, he loses his balance and starts to go off the back, would have fallen, 6-7 feet had Mal not caught him. They are getting worn out. So really, I think in 63, they're still jubilant. They're still excited. They're still, seeing their name in lights. But by March of 64, it begins to erode away because it becomes very hard work. I used to read a chapter a day to my parents when they were alive. And we were on 64 when my mom passed away. One of the last things that she said to me was, those poor boys, did they ever get a day off?
She was wise.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really something. Was it different for John in the way that he reacted to it all, or did they all experience the same thing? Because John also had the books that he wrote.
Yep.
So because sometimes I get the feeling that, Paul seemed to just enjoy everything. He loved all the fame. He loved all the acclaim. He loved doing all the concerts. Of course, 66 was crazy. And we all know why they stopped touring after what they went through. But I get the feeling that John internalized his problems more than the others.
Yeah, I think George was the unhappiest. George he really almost wanted out. he never thought that it was going to escalate to that level. And he said to them at the end of 64, I don't want to tour anymore. It was scary. It was frightening. And I don't think he had come from a very insular family, a quiet life. He really didn't expect it to explode the way that it did. And I would say the next most disturbed person about it was John, because he had many other pressures, not just the music. But they asked him, Kenneth also said, if you could do only one thing, would it be write books or be a Beatle? And he said, oh, write books. I've been doing that long before I became a Beatle. I mean, he wrote that Sport, Speed, and Illustrated by J.W. Lennon. He was a writer. And he said, there's no doubt about it. That's what I would do. So he's writing, he's honing his art. He's still doing his single line sketches. He's moving into this house. He's struggling with his marriage. And after he's given LSD the first time and finds out that it can relieve some of his pressure and take some of the stress away, and he begins moving toward LSD and Cynthia moves away, now he's got problems in his marriage. He had a lot of other things going on besides just the pressures of Beatlemania. And you're right, Paul loved it. Paul enjoyed every bit of it. You rarely ever see Paul complain or see Paul in a bad mood. One time in 1964, on the 1964 North American tour, something had happened. I don't know what it was, but Paul comes into a press conference and does not speak the entire time. Not a word. He's upset about something, but we're never told what it is. That is the only time, and I've been doing this for 36 years this year, that's the only example I can give you of Paul being upset. He's generally in a good mood.
It's interesting. You find out later on, you'd never know the Beatles were going through any struggles in 64 and 65. You watch A Hard Day's Night, you watch Help, they look like they're having the time of their lives. But you find out later on through John's comments saying Rolling Stone, how much he didn't like having to have to wear the suits, that they were selling out. Paul commented about it and said, I don't remember John ever complaining about that. He knew this is what you had to do to hit it big. This was their appearance. They all had to dress the same. He didn't complain about that. John would talk about not just referring to the Beatles, but other acts that they were performing fleas. He used that expression.
Yeah, he did.
Complaining how they couldn't hear themselves, that kind of thing. He didn't like how the Beatles were treated like gods, how the Beatles had to perform in front of cripples, things like that. You didn't hear the other.
But it wasn't just performing. They almost expected them to heal people. Yeah. They would bring them back in wheelchairs and say, touch my son, touch my daughter. That was more responsibility than John wanted to have. I mean, it was scary to him that he was being elevated to that level. But you're absolutely right, and I tend to be the same way. I'll say things like, last year was a terrible year. It was just a terrible year. And my husband will say, no, think about it. You remember when we did this? And you remember when we did that? And you remember how you laughed when we did this? I'll be like, oh yeah. They're just some personalities that focus on the dark. You just are drawn. That is who you are. And so I'm sure if we said to John, what about that time when you were in the Bahamas and you did such and such, or you remember that night in Key West when you and Paul went down to the beach, we could probably bring up a lot of good things that happened, but taken as a whole, rolling it all together, it looks like a bad year to him.
It just goes to show how human they are. And it's reminding me of the whole experience about the Let It Be film.
Yes.
The Beatles thought that film was really, it depicted what it really was. You watch Get Back, and there were some really good times in the studio with the four of them. It wasn't all misery. So, and for years and years, that's what the Beatles thought Let It Be was. So you also reminded me of something that you said there when he had to give his speech for In His Own Right, that when the Beatles did the Royal Variety Show, John was really nervous about telling his joke, because he was there alone telling it, the rattle your jewelry stuff. So for him to do anything by himself and make a speech, he was nervous to do that.
Yeah, and you can always tell when he's nervous because he does the exact same thing. If he's getting ready to say something that's a little bit naughty and he knows it is, he scratches his sideburn before he says it. Always, always. And he does it on that. But and I won't say, because I'm sure that we don't want to use John's language on the show, but he wasn't going to say rattle your jewelry. He was going to say rattle your expletive deleted jewelry. And he told Brian that he was going to, and I did a whole study on where he told Brian, because of the 20 or 23 different sources of John threatening to say that, some of them say he told him in the dressing room, someone say he told him the day before, some say he told him right before the show, but he told Brian that's what he was going to say. He made Brian cry, because Brian is like, you cannot say that. You are going to ruin not only your chances, but you are going to ruin the chances for everyone else. And you cannot say that. And John was like, yeah, sorry, I'm saying it. Well, so Brian goes out to sit with his parents in the audience, thinking that he's going to say that, and he doesn't say it. I mean, just like when he told Charlie O. Finley, Charlie kept saying, play 2 extra songs for us. Kansas City gave you all this money. Play 2 extra songs, play 2 extra songs. And John looks at him and says, I wish I could do as well as Scott. You shouldn't have paid so much for us, Chuck. So, but what does he do? He plays the 2 extra songs. They do it. But he's just being ornery. And he is really, when he says that, he's a little bit nervous because he's told Brian he's going to say something naughty and he doesn't say it. It's still cheeky, but it's not as bad as what he wanted to say.
Brian's heart must have been racing
Yeah.
at that moment. Can you was going through if it actually said that word, but
yeah.
Anyway, since you mentioned Brian, how much significance do you place on the vacation that John took with him? And I'm kind of surprised when you look back that it was 12 days.
Yeah,
12 days at a time when they hardly had any time off.
Yeah, and everybody calls it that night in Barcelona. Well, number one, it wasn't in Barcelona. Number two, it was a long, lovely vacation. And it's something that today we would applaud people for, because John reaches out and says, at this time, it wasn't being gay, it was being homosexual, and it was illegal, and you got arrested for it, and it had a huge stigma. And he says to Brian, what is it like? Tell me what you see. And what do you see in that guy? What do you see in this guy? What are you looking for? They have Brian talks about it. It's recorded in so many different biographies in so many different ways. It was the hardest chapter I've ever had to write, because John even contradicts himself on what happened. He says we did have relations, then he says we didn't. There's so many different sources. And I went out for a run, and while I was running, it came to me how to end that chapter. But here's the thing. In May of 1963, John has a big decision to make. He knew from the day he admitted Paul to the group that Paul was smart, talented, as talented, if not more talented than he was. He was a leader. He was a force to be reckoned with. And Paul immediately brings the next member into the group, George. And John puts him off for a while, but then Paul just brings him to the morgue skiffle cellar in March of 1958, 9, and says, he's going to play with us. So he's here. And John's like, what's he doing here? I didn't say he'd come. He's here. He's playing with us tonight. And Paul it's constantly, edging each other out to be the leader. When people say, why did the Beatles break up? I always say, why didn't they break up before? Because you've got two big dogs who are having to get along together and to share this limelight. And so this trip is going to cement John's relationship with Brian. They're going to become extremely close. They understand each other. They're going to speak the same language. And the debate over McCartney-Lennon and Lennon-McCartney is ended. It's Lennon-McCartney. That's the way it's going to be. And John is going to be the leader, of course, until he begins to get involved with drugs and drift off. And Paul says in the anthology, that's why John went on that trip. That's the kind of guy he is. Yep, that's the kind of guy he is. He's going to make sure that he keeps control of his band. And I think he loved Brian. No, I don't think. I know he loved Brian. He loved Brian, and Brian loved him. And in September of 1963, and this is never discussed, never, but when he takes Cynthia to Paris on their honeymoon, they have 4 glorious days together. She calls it my short honeymoon. And on day number 5, Brian arrives and Cynthia goes home. And John and Brian stay in Paris for another week together. They are very close. And when he goes on that trip, to make sure that they have a close friendship. And they do. And Brian, you know how important Brian was, Ken. Once Brian's gone, it's difficult.
Yeah, sure. So Paul was right all along in figuring out, how they bonded together. And, part of the reason why they took that vacation in Spain was so Brian would recognize that John really was the leader of the group. But from the very beginning, would you say that those two were competitive with each other? It became so much more apparent later on.
So competitive. When John sings in the cavern, John sings Love Me Do. And George Martin says, no, you can't sing it because you do the harmonica and it's going to be Love Me Why. People are going to be calling it Love Me Why. You can't do that. And so Paul is going to have to sing it. Paul struggles with it because he does a brilliant job, but he doesn't want to do it. That isn't his range. He doesn't want to do it. It's John's song. Well, when it hits the charts and it goes up the charts, John's like, all right, fine. I'll write another song, and writes Please, Please Me. They are constantly, thank God they are so competitive, because nothing is better than 2 geniuses competing with one another for who can write the next best song. Yes, we all benefited from it. It became the most brilliant soundtrack because you have 2 great musicians trying to outdo one another.
There's no doubt that fans feel that way.
Yeah.
But there'll only be like a few moments in interviews that they gave where like Paul would say something like, wow, you're writing Strawberry Fields, I've got Penny Lane, and yeah, it's obvious how great the two of them were competing with each other, but I don't think they admitted it all that much. And even if you take a look at the early years of the Beatles, and sometimes I like to group it between like the Red and the Blue album, 62 to 60, John's songs that were either written entirely by John or mainly by John are far more dominant in that period.
Sure. Than
in 67 to 70, where it was a bit more balanced between Paul and John. So I think in the early years, John wrote a lot more than Paul did. But Paul, when he did deliver good songs, he also delivered great songs too.
Yeah.
But I just don't know if at that early a stage that the two of them were really competing that much. I think, one would inspire the other to write something great. Definitely. But you definitely think that
they were definitely competing with each other, not in a bad way, not in a I don't like him, I'm gonna kick his butt. That's not it. It was that, okay, he did that, well, I can do that. I can do that. Oh, well, I can do that too. They had the same symbiotic relationship that they eventually have when the Beach Boys start putting out really incredible things, and they're inspired, and so they kick it into high gear. Then the Beach Boys kick it into high gear. Then the Beatles, same thing with the Byrds. You hear what the Byrds are doing, okay, we can incorporate that into what we're doing. They inspire each other. They compete, but they don't compete in an angry, hostile kind of way. It's still a friendship. It's still a partnership, but we can be partners and still, oh, well, Ken did that, well, I can do this. You can inspire me to be a better person. And I think that's what they did. That Paul had that idea. okay, let me see what idea I can come up with.
Was it always a friendly competition, or would you say there was some jealousy involved? Because I always remember John making a comment around the time of Magical Mystery Tour that John would come in with 2 songs and Paul would come in with 9 or something like that. And John was very upset about the fact that Hello Goodbye was an A-side to Eye on the Walrus.
Yeah.
Things like that. So
It did get at him somewhat. I agree with you, because Can't Buy Me Love wins the Ivor Novello Award. And John is really, he tells Cynthia, it's in her book, he's really put out because he recorded almost every song on that record. It's dominantly a Lennon LP. And yet what wins the Ivor Novello Award? Can't Buy Me Love. He's like, I'm sick of that song. So, people are human. They're human. And he wanted to always be the toppermost of the poppermost. But John had no one to blame but himself for what's happening around the time of Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper, because he is abdicating leadership of the band because he's so heavily involved in drugs at that time. And he is not putting out as much as Paul is putting out. Paul is writing more. He's being more productive. The very things that Paul was worried about when he said he didn't want to get involved with LSD, and George and John kept goading him to take it, and you're a sissy, and whatever else they said to him, Paul was right. LSD does change your productivity. And for John, it opened new vistas. We would never have She Said without it, probably. We might not ever have Tomorrow Never Knows without it. It opened new vistas, but it shifted his focus inward instead of outward. And so I think the two were extremely competitive, but I think as much as it can humanly happen, it wasn't animosity. It was a good sort of competitiveness.
Right. Well, definitely after Brian died, Paul was driving the train.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, I do think some people say that his productivity went downhill. I don't really see it that way, because if you take a look at the White Album,
he's back by White Album. He's back.
It's pretty even there. Maybe
Yeah.
with the Let It Be album, you had to resurrect One After 909.
Yeah.
But overall, if you take a look at 67 to 70, it really is a more, if you only in terms of how many songs did John write, how many songs did Paul write, and I know that there are times when they collaborated together. It's a lot closer.
Yeah. Well, it's, to me, the first years that John dominated. Then you have Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour. That's Paul. By White Album, John is back. He has 14 songs. I mean, he has enough for a whole album. So he is really back. Does that mean that that Paul's songs on White Album weren't great? No, they're phenomenal. But John's productivity is back. And same thing, like you say, he finishes out the career strong, but there was that gap, and that gap coincides with the years that he is heavily involved with LSD. And it just, Cynthia says, when I wouldn't take it with him, he started going out. He'd come home with strangers. He would come home at odd hours. He wouldn't speak. He was almost catatonic. He was here. He was absent, but present. It changed him for several years. And then he gets a grip. He meets Yoko, for one thing. And he changes back. But both of them, the other night, Scott and I were in Giordano's in Chicago at the end of the Chicago Fest for Beatles fans. And a man got up from the table next to us, and he had on a Rolling Stone shirt. And I said to him, "Hey, you've got the wrong shirt on." And he was young. And he said, "Hey, I'm from an era in which you don't have to choose. I like them both." And I think that's where all Beatle fans should be. We don't have to choose. Right. We can be happy for the albums where Paul dominated and gave us Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's a very Paul-centric LP, and it's great. It is great. And we can be happy for the albums in which John dominated at the beginning. we were blessed to have two great, and look, George Harrison, oh my gosh, the man is phenomenal. He is, in any other setting, he would have been recognized as, unbelievable, but he's overshadowed by the two of them, but he's phenomenal. And Ringo Starr, not only is he a great, talented drummer, I just read John's quote about him in the David Sheff Playboy interviews about what a phenomenal drummer he is. But not only that, he's the stabilizing influence for the band. He's the star of both of the movies. He is the one that when John wanted to know if something was good or bad, he would go to Ringo and say, what do you think of this? And if Ringo said it was crap, it was gone. So, they're all great.
They all made such massive contributions. But I just want to say one thing about Sgt. Pepper, because a few times I've said this before in my but I think John deserves a lot more credit for the Sgt. Pepper album, because there are things that people don't give him credit for, the extra line and getting better.
Yeah.
The Pepper melody and She's Leaving Home.
Yes.
For most of our lives, with a little help from my friends, was a co-write.
Yep.
So it wasn't completely Paul dominated. The idea to do this other an album by another band with this name, this other identity, yes, that was Paul's. But just in terms of the music and song by song,
yes,
there's a lot more John than people give him credit for. I'm not trying to take away anything from Paul by saying.
No, I agree.
And you've got A Day in the Life too, which anchors the entire album, I think.
Yeah. Scott, did you want to add anything? Because I know Jude's been,
No, I've been listening. I haven't heard her talk about 1964 before, and I'm wow. I was listening very avidly, so very interesting.
Not starting on 1964. He's already starting to record the audiobook for that year. So these things are tomes. You can work out with them. So this is what he's facing now.
Okay.
So,
I mean, look how thick that thing is.
Oh yeah, all your books are thick.
I feel
it's a little intimidating, but I do it one voice at a time. That's how I broke it down, and that makes it manageable. It's not a race; it's a marathon. So you just do a little bit at a time, and then it all adds up. And the next thing you know is you're having more fun than you've had in any project you've ever had in your life.
Let's just talk about the music of 63. And if you want to, the first few months of 64, what are the most significant songs that you think John wrote at the time? Because even in their early years, they put out brilliant stuff.
Brilliant stuff. There is this belief that John wrote nothing autobiographical until he met Bob Dylan, which is in the last day of August 1964. And if you go back and you look at what is on Please Please Me and what then is on With the Beatles, which is most of it is in the can before they ever meet Bob Dylan. There are so many autobiographical songs. Let's just take first the covers on Please Please Me. Before John is writing originals, he's choosing covers that tell his story. More than anyone I know, John is the personification of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, if people have ever read that poem. He's a sailor who has caused the death of everybody on the ship that he sailed on. And so he spends his life grabbing people by the arm and saying, let me tell you my story. And he tells the story over and over and over. And John's telling the story first through covers. Baby It's You, which happens to be my favorite Beatles song.
Sha-la-la-la-la.
That's it. He's in
or all of their songs.
It's my favorite.
Really?
It's my favorite. It so speaks to his life. You can see this little boy sitting in the Mendip's parlor, listening to Dick Barton's Special Agent on the wireless. And he can hear Mimi and George saying in the kitchen, she's immoral. She's out again tonight, and she's still married to that Fred Lennon, and that boy is not being taken care of. She doesn't know when he's here and when he's not. He gets on the bus and he appears here, and blah, blah, blah. You can just hear the stuff that they're saying. You should hear what they say about you. Cheat, cheat. They say you'll never, ever be true, but oh, it doesn't matter what they say. You know, I'm going to love you any old way. That song is from his heart. And Anna,
How do you know that? How do you know
because he
that's
tells
the
you,
song that he loves?
he flat out tells you half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia. He is singing for her over and over again at the microphones of the world. He tells you that's his mission statement. There's a place. So John's dealing at the time that he writes There's a Place, which is in Hamburg at Siemens Mission, in that dark room in the afternoon, cold, before the people come in and light the fires. And he's in there plunking it out on the piano, and he's still dealing with the death of his mother. He's separated from her as a child. And then he finds out, his cousin says, well, she only lives a mile from you. And they ride over on their bikes. And he finds out that she's at 1 Blomfield Road. And guess what? She's got 2 children. So it's not children she doesn't want. It's me. It's not that she doesn't like kids. She doesn't want me. And his heart is broken. And he does everything to win her attention, her love, her approval. Same thing with Mimi. When she throws away his pictures, he goes, you're going to be sorry you threw my stuff away. I'm going to be famous someday. I mean, Mimi records that. You're going to be sorry you threw that stuff away, trying to get attention. And so There's a Place, it's 1960, August 1960. His heart is still, his mother's only been gone a couple of years. And he's still dealing with that. He's lost her a second time to death. When they hook up, they become best friends, they become soulmates, they do everything together. Now she's gone for good. And he's dealing with this, and he says there are 2 ways he can cope with it. 1, he can write songs and pour the pain into the music. 2, there's a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind. And there's no time when I'm alone, I think of you. It is a major John Lennon song, prefiguring what's going to come in Tell Me Why and I'll Cry Instead. Same song, same story, different tune, but he's telling you his story. And then With the Beatles, the cover, Smokey Robinson's You Really Got a Hold on Me, when he sings it for the BBC, you know what he says. You hear him, you really got a hold on me, mother. You know, it's right out there. I don't like you. You left me behind. I wanted you. I needed you. I cried for you. You weren't there. But when you came back, Mimi needs Julia to come over and make a costume for John for a play at school. And Julia comes over, but instead of making the little boy a costume, she makes a dough out of flour and water, and she paints his face with food coloring, and they run around the kitchen like Indians, which is what he's supposed to be in the play. And there's food coloring everywhere, and there's flour everywhere, and Mimi comes home and there's no costume made. She comes back to be fun, and then she's gone again for 2 months, and then she's back. And you hurt me then. You're back again. Oh, not a second time. And that beautiful composition that prefigures all these other nowhere man, and I'm a loser, and I don't want to spoil the party, so I'll go. They're on those albums, and that's long before he meets Bob Dylan. In his Playboy interview, he says, Paul writes songs about other things. I only write songs about myself.
Is it possible that this is just your interpretation of John's songs? Because unless John actually specifically says, I'll Cry Instead is about Julia, or what, in an interview, how would you know? I mean, I can understand, and I understand your reasoning behind it all.
Yeah.
But even as far as the songs that he covers, you know, they all covered songs that they loved by artists that they admired greatly. How do you know this wasn't just another case with Baby It's You? Or, you know,
if I tell you the same thing over and over and over, and I tell it to you in different language and in different ways and with different illustrations, but I keep telling you the same thing over and over for 10 years. And then after I've told you, I've got every reason on earth to be, he put both sad and mad. He changed the lyrics because I've just lost the only girl I have. I could get my way and give myself right up today, but I can't. So I'll cry instead. If I keep telling you the same story and I phrase it in different ways. After a while, you begin to get it. Yeah, you're telling me the same story. And he says, like I said, Paul writes songs about other things. I only write about myself. And then I cap it off with my mission statement. Half of what I say is meaningless, but why do I say it? Just to reach you, Julia. He's singing the same song over and over and over. So, you know, I just, it seems to me, if you hear the same story, the same words, it's bound to be about the same thing. You really got a hold on me, Mother.
You know, you make your case.
Yeah.
But, you know, I just think that John had the same ability to write boy-girl songs
Oh,
about
sure.
a relationship that worked or didn't,
Sure.
you know?
Sure. But you asked me what the most important songs were, in my opinion. And so I gave you my answer, which is, I think these were the most important songs on those two LPs because they prefigure these works that are to come, which is goaded on and amplified by Dylan's freewheeling, which is very autobiographical. And he begins to write more of them in the 65, 66. But in these early albums, these are the ones that I think that stand out and speak to me because they are so honest and from his heart. But I agree with you. He is writing, I mean, ask me why. And, you know, and even from me to you, that's just boy girl songs. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I was just trying to answer, you know, what I think is the most important.
Yeah, and I look at There's a Place as being a precursor to Strawberry Fields.
Yep.
You know, drifting in your mind, letting your mind wander, you know.
Yep.
Letting that happen, allowing that to happen.
Yeah, and Strawberry Fields is highly autobiographical. No one, I think, is in my tree. Yeah, nobody's like me. I'm all alone. It must be high or low. You know, again, he's singing about himself, just like he said. So yeah, I agree with you.
It's in 1964, but what about I'll Be Back? Did
Yeah.
John ever say where that song came from or what it was aimed at?
No.
Because that's in the same vein, I think.
Yeah, exactly. The song, even when it's veiled in going to a party and the party of, you know, and she doesn't show, and I'm gonna leave because I don't want to spoil the party. It's so many times you hear the same feeling of I've been left behind and nobody, no one cares. To me, if someone said, what was John Lennon about? I would say he was about trying to win love, trying to win recognition that what he was doing was important and acceptable because he was never given that. He tells you later on, it's not love that I'm being expert in. How can I give love when I don't know what love is? You know, no one ever loved me. No one gave that to me. So how do you expect me to give it to someone else? And that's what he's trying to do. It's the search for significance.
You know, in some of the interviews that you've done, you kind of give the impression that you think that John was really a tortured soul. And you even said earlier in this interview that, you know, like the first 10 years of his life shaped him. I mean, this is what carried him the rest of his life. Do you think that overall in his 40 years, was he basically very unhappy, or were there times when he was genuinely a happy person?
They're all, you know, it's like I was saying about Rand pointing out to me if I say that was a bad year, and he goes, well, what about when we went to New Orleans? Wasn't that a good weekend? Or what about, you know, yes, he had lots of happy moments. He laughed stepping off that plane in February of 1964 and seeing those fans. He's laughing and his face is so happy. And you can see him just falling out laughing with the Beatles over inside jokes. And there are moments of happiness, but not knowing why, when Julia brings him back from Blackpool to Mendip's, and he says to her, you're not going to leave me, right? And she says, go play with Sally in the backyard. And then she leaves and doesn't say goodbye. And he's there with Mimi and George. And Mimi and George were good to him. They took him to the Empire Theater, to Christmas pantomimes. George would sneak him off to the picture dromes. It wasn't that. It was that his mother was gone. And his father, who's writing to him regularly, Mimi's tearing up the letters. He has no idea his dad's contacting him. He just thinks he's vanished. And that's a big hurt. That's a big hurt for anybody or any little boy to deal with. And then when Uncle George dies and he doesn't get to be there to say goodbye, and they buried him and there's no closure, and Uncle George is the one that's shown him love and attention and care, and he's gone when John's 14 and a half and needs a father figure, again, that is a big wound. And just 2.5 years later, his mother, who steps in to replace George as his best friend, now she's gone. Hey, that's a lot of hurt for somebody to deal with. That's more than most of us will have to deal with in our entire lifetime. And I think he does remarkably well to bear that much pain and turn it into music, turn it into the soundtrack of our lives. Some people would just give up. He doesn't give up. He makes it into music. So, I don't really write about John Lennon because he's a great composer, or he's a great singer, or he's a great artist, or he's a great peace activist, or he is any of the things that he is, an author. I write about John Lennon because he did not let life defeat him. He never gave up. No matter what happened, he found a way to go on. He didn't let the separation from his parents stop him. He didn't let Uncle George's death stop him. He didn't let his mother's death stop him. He didn't let Stu's death, his soulmate, stop him. He kept going. And in my life, that's important to have a lesson like that you just have to keep going.
You summed it all up so perfectly there, Jude. I'd love to end the interview that way, but I still want to ask you, John being a complicated person, sometimes I have a difficulty when someone will say, you have to take everything John said with a grain of salt, because I think that everything that he said in his interviews was how he felt in that moment. So I think that it has value, even if he changed his mind a week later. It still was him. It's truthful to who he was. Do you see John as being far more complicated? Because I look at him as a straight shooter. Whatever came out of his mouth was how he felt. And it is possible to have conflicting feelings about so many things in this world. I just said on my podcast show on Things We Said Today, he could be cursing out Paul McCartney in one interview, and then in another interview, he'll say he's my best male friend. This is who John Lennon was. Yeah. And I think it tells you a lot about him.
Yeah.
Not everything is so clear cut and black and white that this is how you feel in life. John was, I think, very complex, but the more that you study him, the more it's easy to understand him.
Yeah, I have a great quote. This is from Ken Womack's book, John Lennon, 1980. And when I read this, I was like, this is the best thing that has ever, this book is phenomenal.
And
it is
amazing stuff.
Oh, and for those of you that don't have it, it's not just about 1980. It starts in 1970 and then takes you all the way up to 1980 so that you put it in context and you understand 1980. But this is what he wrote. He said, John was of two mind about things often. Indeed, his endlessly fecund, fertile, rich, inquisitive mind, his fecund, always vacillating mind may have been his most salient personality trait. Not only was he sometimes a contrarian, but he was also always in a state of flux regarding virtually anything or anyone, including himself. We talked before the show about the fact that I'm pretty much who I was when I was 5 years old. I have spaghetti and meatballs has been my favorite dish since I was 5. Reading a book has been my favorite thing to do since I was 6. I've eaten the same thing for breakfast for decades and decades. I am the same always. I rarely change about anything. That's probably not a good quality, except for I love the people I love and I keep loving them and loving them and loving them, but John wasn't that way. You give John new information and suddenly his mind's changed. He can take it and run with it. So in Atlantic City in 1964, they bring a bunch of girls into the hotel room and he's trying to watch a program on TV. And he says rather loudly, women are to be obscene and not heard. you know, that's the same John that writes Woman is the End of the World.
Yeah.
You know, he changes. They ask him about politics in 1963, and he goes, I'm not one bit interested in politics. But by 1964, in the press conferences, he's starting to make comments about Lyndon Johnson, and he's starting to make comments about Vietnam. And Brian is, you know, don't do that, trying to put the thumb on him. He changes. And if you give him new information, he can change by tomorrow, and he can change again by next week. That's just who he is. The other thing is what we've already talked about, and that is that he's dealing with a very well-deserved, it's not like it's like he didn't have reason, but he's dealing with depression. And some days John wakes up in a bad mood, as do we all. And I can see it when he walks into the room at a press conference. When he walks in the room, I would go, oh no, because you could see the look on his face. They are in for it now. He could be a very happy, funny, welcoming person. I talked to Larry Kane, Art Schreiber, Ivor Davis, Bob Berry. Every one of the DJs that were on the 1964 North American tour said John was my favorite person to be around. He was interesting. He was funny. He was great to be around. But as we know, he could also be, as they said at Quarry Bank Grammar when I interviewed the head boy, Dave Binion, he said John was a salt. And I don't mean salt of the earth. I mean, he was a salt in an open wound. He could find what bothered you and he would get at you. So yes, he could be that person. And why? Because of the hurt that he had endured. If he doesn't know you and he thinks that you're better than he is, or you know, he feels insecure because he never felt secure. He never felt like he was good enough. So if he doesn't feel good enough, he gets at you. Larry Kane walks in the room. First time he meets John, he's got on this gorgeous suit, tie. He's about John's age, but he's all dressed up. And John says to him, why are you dressed like a fag ass, man? Well, because he thinks that Larry Kane is looking down his nose at him. Larry smarts off to him, and John shuts up. And 30 minutes later, he goes over and says, I'm sorry I said that. I just felt like, I don't know, I'm sorry. And they become best friends. So he always is defending himself, defending his territory. I think you know what he said to Tony Barrow. I won't repeat that because it may not be something we can repeat on the show, but he says it because he thinks that people won't like him, and he's defending his territory. Once he finds out that you'll stand toe to toe with him and that you do like him and you do respect him, he becomes a nice person in the world to be around. So yeah, he's complex, but by complex, I don't mean disturbed or difficult. I mean, he was dealing with a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think he wanted admiration from people, but he didn't want, idolatry.
Right. Right.
So if you stood up to him, he probably admired you more for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a teacher just like that in college. I started college a year early as a little high school kid, and the teacher, Dr. Austin Temple, picked on me every single class because I was only 16 and I was afraid and I was intimidated, and I would get upset and I would tear. And one day I finally got mad and I smarted back to him, and he threw his head back and started laughing, and he became one of my favorite professors, and we're still friends to this day. Sometimes you got to stand up for yourself.
Okay, just out of curiosity, you mentioned so many people that you've interviewed. Did you ever interview or just meet any of the Beatles?
I did not meet any of the Beatles. I wasn't even allowed to go to their concert. And Scott knows this story. My dad, once a month, would call me into his office, sit me down, and say, you're in love with that John Lennon, and it's got to stop. He's a hoodlum. And I would stand up for him, and then he'd end up hitting me with a ruler right across my hands like I was at Quarry Bank Grammar. Never changed me, never wavered from it. And before my dad died, he was a huge John Lennon fan. But they would not let me go to the concert in New Orleans when they came to City Park. I couldn't go, and I was only a few hours away. But 2 or 3 years later, they dropped me off with the 4 other girls at the Jimi Hendrix concert. I guess Jimmy wasn't a hoodlum like John. So, you know, no, I didn't get to be. The closest I've ever been is I got to go to the Bryant Park concert that Good Morning America put on for Ringo. And Rand and I got there at like 2 a.m, but there are already 50 people ahead of us in line. And I won't tell you how I got in to the front row because it's shameful. And I shouldn't even, it was not a good thing. I'll tell you privately.
Okay.
But I got on the front row and I'd made a poster that said, I wanted to write something that Ringo would know. I knew more about him than the fact that he was in the Beatles. So I said, Richie, congrats on smashing the Kaiser Keller stage before the Beatles. Because you remember they had that contest with them. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and the Beatles were competing to see who could break the Kaiser Keller stage. And they jumped on it and jumped on it and jumped on it. Well, Rory, because Rory was huge, he broke through and won a case of champagne from the Beatles at a time when they really couldn't afford a case of champagne. And the Beatles were down the street having a drink when they heard the shouting and the screaming, and they knew that Rory had won. So I held that up, and Ringo singing with a little help from my friends, and he went and started laughing, and they had to start the song over again. That's my brush with greatness.
You're the only one that would come up with a sign like that.
It's true.
Can you just mention a few of the people? I know you already have mentioned some of them, but like Bill Harry, you've mentioned, or who have been the most interesting people that you've interviewed in doing your research?
Well, definitely the day that I got to go out to Helen Anderson's house. She was his best mate at Liverpool College of Art. And they used to do crazy things together, like take down the street signs around Liverpool and then go put them in the canteen at Liverpool College of Art when the canteen would open. It'd be all signs from, they did so many things together. And we got to go to her house out in Chester and visit with her. And she had John's sketchbook, not the Daily Howl, but one of his sketchbooks that he had traded her for a sweater that she was wearing. And so just getting to really know her was fantastic. And she was very kind to make both Scott and me one of her leather linen caps that she makes. And we were really thrilled with that. June Furlong, who was the life model at Liverpool College of Art, John followed her around like a puppy dog because she was famous. I mean, Lucian Foy, all of Francis Bacon, all of the big artists had painted June. And so they, are you trying to tell me something? Yes. Can you? Thank you very much. Rand, we had an appointment. He called and let the person know about it, but I was being distracted because I was watching him try to show me a sign. Jude Furlong was so annoyed by this kid that followed her like a puppy dog that she finally said, "What do you want?" And he's like, "I want to know how you got to be famous. What did you do that made you famous?" And they got to be good friends. And she even loaned him her grandmother's dress and earrings for the Cinderella pantomime that they put on at Liverpool College of Art. And she showed me that. They're people that, I mean, we got to meet the standard people. Of course, Alan Williams. I have the distinction of being told to F off by Alan Williams because I asked him to dance and he said no. And I said, "Please, Alan, please just dance with me one time." That's when he set me straight. Beryl Adams.
Was Alan, just because, there were times he was very bitter by the way that the Beatles treated him. Was he that way with you, or was he just happy about being a part of history?
He,
and proud of that association?
No, Alan was not happy about that. Alan made a big mistake and he knew it. And he was very sad. I mean, he felt like nothing in his life really ever went right. And I know he could have continued to be the Beatles manager and he didn't. But still, if you were the Beatles' first manager, and he did a lot for them. I mean, he absolutely taught them to mock shout. I mean, don't just stand there, boys. That's why they lost the Empire Theater gig to Nicky Cuff and the Sunnyside Skiffle Group, because Nicky Cuff performed. He jumped up on the microphone. He slid across the stage, and the Beatles just stood there and performed. And, or the Quarrymen as they were then. Alan taught them to be a lot of who they were, and he missed out. He was bitter. He wasn't mean about it. that wasn't all he talked about. I mean, it was a lot of fun. And an evening with Alan Williams is an evening you'll never forget. I've been kicked out of so many places with Alan. You know, they called him the Bard of Liverpool because he was barred from every place in Liverpool. And literally at a nice restaurant, a lovely French restaurant on Button Street with Beryl Adams, who he was living with that time. She used to be married to Bob Wooler, and she worked for Brian at NIMS. And things were fine at first. And about the second bottle of wine, he got up and went into the other room and made everybody in the restaurant sing the Welsh national anthem. And they asked us to leave. So, you know, he was a lot of fun, but he wasn't happy about what happened. He was very upset about the fact that he did this. I'm trying to think, you know, Rod Murray, who lived with Stu and John, and was building his own bass guitar to be in the Beatles when Stu won the Wars art contest and was half of summer painting, and John forced him to buy a guitar. I did so many great people over the years that I never dreamed I would ever get to meet. In fact, when Helen Anderson called and said, look, you've been to Liverpool twice and you've interviewed everyone I know, all of my friends, but you never asked to talk to me. Well, I didn't ask because I didn't think she'd talk to me. At that time, she was the dress designer for Dallas. So, I mean,
Nope.
I didn't think she'd talk to me. Well, I want you to come talk to me when you, I said, well, I'm coming in 2 weeks. She goes, well, come to my house, call me. Here's my number. Come out to Chester. When I hung that phone up, it's the middle of the night, 4 a.m. I guess, you know, she didn't think about the time difference. I'm jumping up and down on the bed going, Helen Anderson, call me. So yeah, it's just been surreal. And, you know, when I think back over, I'm sure I've told you about the night that we went to the premiere of Backbeat. Have I told you this story?
Remember.
I'll tell you the abbreviated version.
Okay.
Afterwards, we were invited to dinner at the John Lennon bar on Matthew Street. And Alan Williams was there, Beryl, and the Seekers, the Searchers, some of the Searchers, Tony Jackson was there, Beryl Marsden was there. And it was just a great night. And we had been invited to the Cavern Club to go to a party over there. So I said, we're going to run to the Cavern Club for 1 minute. We'll be right back. Dinner was over. We'd finished dinner and all that. We come back and the owner of the John Lennon bar and his wife have come and they've taken our places. Cool. I'm not going to eat anything more. We're done. We just stood against the wall. And Alan Williams sat a few drinks and he says to the owner of the bar, that's Jude's chair. Get out. He said, I'm not getting out. I own this bar. And Alan shoved him and he shoved Alan. And then they got into a fist fight. And my husband said to me, if I told you when you were 9 years old and you were having to choose which Beatle to fall in love with, that someday you would be on Matthew Street in the John Lennon bar, people would be fighting over what chair you were sitting in. I said, say no more. Happiest night of my life.
You had Alan Williams fight for you.
I know. That's my claim to fame, Ken.
In all the interviews that you've done, do you have audio of it or video, or is it all transcribed?
No, we have audio. In fact, we made a CD of the interview with Alan Williams that we included on the second edition or the second printing of Should Have Been There. With each printing of Should Have Been There, we try to include something different. And that was in the second printing. We had that CD in the back, and I still have that. We didn't do as much as we should. In fact, Rand tried to get me to do more. When we saw Backbeat, the next day we're in the Grapes, and all of the actors from Backbeat come in and go to the bar. And he goes, go get their autographs. I'm like, I'm not going to go get their autographs. I don't want to be that person. But now I wish I had. You know, I should have done more recording. You want to act like you're calm and you're, you know, I should have done more.
I know. Have you ever thought about putting out a book of your interviews transcribed?
I have not thought about that. That's a really, really, really great idea. I would have to find time to do it. I'm working so hard to try to get these next books done. And, you know, if you write the book, you have to sell the book. So I write for Culture Sonar every month, and I write the Fest blog every month. And the Fest blog, we're going song by song through. We did Rubber Soul, and now we're doing Revolver. And I'm not a music person at all. You could do it with your eyes shut. I have to do hours and hours of research to do these. It takes me 10 to 12 hours just to do the research for the Fest blog, much less write it. So I just don't have any time in the day, you know.
I just want you to finish this whole series.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Mark Lewison too. Don't disturb Mark Lewison.
Yes.
Disturb Jude.
Yes. And I want to say, for all the people that are giving Mark Lewison grief about not getting this done, look, I'm just dealing with one Beatle. He's got all four, and Brian, and all of the corporation that goes along with it, and all of the DJs, and all of the promoters of the dance halls. And I mean, he's got so much to deal with. Give him a break.
Oh, I agree.
Yes,
I mean, we know
it's
it's supposed to be 3 volumes.
Yeah.
While he's working on the second, he's also got to be working on the third at the same time, because you're interviewing people, especially people from that period. You got to be grateful they're still with us. Get them while you can. So, you know, a lot of the stuff that he's doing now is also going to be for the final book.
That's right. When I went to Liverpool, the 7 times that I went, and we would do 3 interviews a day, I was trying to get people that I thought by the time I get to the last book, they're not going to be here. You know, so I was trying to get people ahead of time. And I'm very fortunate because I have Rand, who does a tremendous amount of, he does all the business work. He does the PowerPoints for the webinars. I have someone that's helping me 24/7. He said, I thought I was going to get to retire, and I'm working harder than I've ever worked in my life. So, you know, Mark doesn't have that.
Yeah. So in the new audiobook, you also have music from the Black Ties. We should point out. I first met them at Charles Rosenay's concerts, Beatles tribute shows here in Connecticut, and then Mark Lapidus had them at the Fest for Beatle fans. They're really tremendous. They are great musicians.
Tremendous. And it's their original songs, and they are so Beatlesque, so true. We use it in the scenes of the last night in the Cavern Club. So we play a little bit of Black Ties, and then we play Ringo's interpretation of that night, and then a little bit of the Black Ties and George's interpretation of that night. We go through the whole chapter like that. And then when they go on the UK tour, we use the Black Ties in between each city so that you get the feeling of traveling and moving and going through. And Rand wrote the music for for chapter 1 and the title music, and for the closing of the book as well. So it takes a village really to do a project like this. It takes a lot of people working together, but mainly my hat is off to Scott, because he did hours and hours and hours. How many months did you record, Scott?
Well, I've recorded the basic tracks in 3 months, but I'm working by myself, so I don't have an editor. And editing takes roughly about 4 times as much as recording does of time, because you have to carefully go through, make sure everything's very legible. You can't make mistakes. Unlike somewhere where you're allowed to riff, like in an audio drama, occasionally, when you're doing a book, it has to be word perfect, because it's the author's work. It's not yours. You're not allowed to reinterpret it or get the words wrong or pronounce things incorrectly. So during that point, I basically had to go through it, do retakes where I had just sentences that just didn't roll right. Plus, I'd gone through at least one cold during the recording process, and I had to edit out all the coughing, jags in between lines, things like that. So it took a while.
So, let me try and understand something. You're working on the 4th book now, right?
Not officially, but I'm working on the research for it, as well as a little bit of I've got a copy of the book as an ebook, and I'm marking that up for where I need to do certain things.
So there will be an audiobook for the 4th book.
Oh, there better be, because 1964 is my favorite Beatle year.
Okay.
The Beatles are still enjoying it. They're really popular. I love A Hard Day's Night to death,
Mhm.
and they still look like they're enjoying it. And I really wanted to cover that. Plus, next year's the 60th anniversary of that. And so wouldn't it be nice to have that out for that?
He
It's
said, I'm going
just
to go
gonna
ahead
be a
and get
lot of work.
started, whether you want to or not, because, and I'm like, Scott, I got 12 months to finish this book. I am trying so hard. They're in EMI, they're making Rubber Soul. I got to get them all the way to Candlestick. And he's like, I'm going to go ahead and get
Well,
started.
yeah, Should Have Known Better's already out. So I can, it's already there. You've already written it. So I can certainly voice it. Gosh,
So you've got to be concerned about finishing your 6th book while keeping up to date on what Scott's doing on the 4th book.
Right. And getting the fest blog.
And right now you don't have to worry about that. That'll be, yeah. So concentrate on what you're supposed to be doing, and then I'll sneak this in when you're least expecting it.
If I could just fly you here, Ken, you could do the Rubber Soul part.
We'll be happy to.
This is Rubber Soul notes. I mean, it's all tight. Look at, that's just the notes.
I greatly admire all that you're doing there, Jude. I also have to ask you, are you still doing the podcast show? She said.
We don't really. We've done 2, I think, this year, or 3. And the reason is Lena Stagg, my partner on She Said, bought a gym. It is the most historic gym in Indiana. It's the Pitt Barbell Club. And she is the owner, the trainer. She trains 12 people a day, the front desk worker, the cleaner, the PR person. She's the only employee, and she does it all, and she's exhausted. And I feel, she just doesn't have time. And then they bought a second gym. So she is just barely keeping her head above water, and she works all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we just kind of have let that go, but we're doing our focal point webinars every other month, and we've had a wonderful time doing those. Right now we're going through Rubber Soul. We just had Bruce on to talk about Norwegian Wood. We read a clip from the new book that's coming out of Norwegian Wood, had a PowerPoint. Rand did a great PowerPoint for it. We do a trivia game like you do, and we enjoy it. And we had almost 200 people come to that, so we're having fun with it. But she said it got to be too much.
Yeah, it's a perfect title for a show with 2 women.
Yeah.
It's like a gift to you both. So
yeah, it was her idea. She is so smart, and I miss doing that with her very much. But you've only got so many hours in the day.
Yeah, man, you're just as busy as she is. So yeah. So if people want to get a copy of the audiobook or even just the standard book, they should go to your website, right?
Yes, and it is on the audiobook, and this is what the cover looks like, so they can see when they're on Nook or Chirp or Audible or Spotify. It's on every single audiobook platform. It's a 33-hour book, and some of the sites are selling it for, one site has it for $4.99. Now you have to sign up for a membership with that one. But oh my gosh, that's the cheapest entertainment that you could possibly get.
Yeah.
Audible still has it for $24.99. But a lot of people have the free monthly selection that they can get. Generally it's running about $14, and it is absolutely incredible. Now, Scott told me he wanted me to record the author's notes, but if I irritate the heck out of you with the Southern accent, when you get to the author's notes, just press next chapter and you don't have to listen to me. You can skip past it. Terry Crane said that he got all the way up to Paul's birthday party. And he said, I wanted to hear what your notes were on that birthday party, to hear what really happened. So I listened to it, and then it's long because there's so many conflicting reports about everything. And he goes, after I listened to it, I went, dadgummit, now I got to go back and listen to the author's notes from the very beginning. But what that is about is all of the discrepancies that this is what Hunter Davies says, this is what Mark Lewison says, this is what Bruce Spicer says, this is what, that kind of thing.
It's so important that you include all of those, because you got to get it from the full perspective of what everyone's saying. And that's the only way that you can make any kind of conclusion, if you can at all. So, yeah. All right. Well, this has been tremendous, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. And I'll put the link to your website, johnlennonseries.com, on there. There's also a link I have for Scott if you want to explore his works. And we should include, if you can send me links for all the audio links for the book.
Wherever you can find digital audiobooks, you can buy this.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons we did not go exclusive with Audible, so that however you get your audiobook goodness, you can find the book there for sale. And a lot of them do not require subscriptions of any kind, like Chirp, for instance.
Okay. So Jude does tremendous work. And if you want to hear the many voices of Scott, especially Bobby Goldsboro, you should read the book.
Thank you so much.
He's aware that you've done his voice on there. So
we so appreciate this, Ken. Thank you very much. I know you are super, super busy. This isn't the only hour you have at the fire, and we thank you for including us.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful that you both showed up for this, and try to have you on again. It's a lot of things I'd like to have you on, Jude, on the channel. Maybe do some other stuff if you're interested, be part of a panel.
I'd love it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks to all of you watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And we'll see you again real soon. See you next time. Take care.
Thank you.